Well, good evening. It really is an honor to get to speak here at the Lincoln Parish Museum. Miss Margaret, she's done a really great job just with working this place, and Mr. Wesley. But yeah, like I said, it's really cool to be able to be here. Usually, what Jacob and I do, and just kind of give you a preface, Jacob Brister was my friend. He and I went down the Mississippi River in a kayak, 21-foot long kayak, summer of 2018. And from Lake Chataqua, Minnesota, to the head of the passes, basically the Gulf of Mexico. Jacob, I wish he could be here tonight too. He'd add some flair, but he's in law school studying away in Mississippi, so he will not be able to be with us tonight. So I'll have to tow his load too a little bit, paddle his load, I guess you could say. Jacob Brister, he is from Lake Providence, Louisiana. He's grown up seeing the Mississippi River. And one summer, we got to be friends in college at Tech. And we got to be friends. We'd hunt, fish, and I got him into kayaking, some bayous, Bayou D'Arbonne around here, and just any flowing piece of water we could find to kayak around here, we would. And he goes back to Lake Providence one summer and meets two guys who take the Missouri River from the western states all the way into where it flows into St. Louis, and they went all the way to the Gulf of Mexico that way. And he got to meet them, and he hollered at me. He called me and he said, "I think this is our goal right here. I think this is what we need to do as kayakers." So me being the real cautious one, and I was like, "Oh yeah, let's do it, man. Let's do it. It'll be easy peasy. We got this." So the summer after that, after some planning and getting some equipment and consulting our parents about it, we took off for Lake Chataqua, Minnesota, and paddled down the river for 59 days. It took us 59 days from May the 29th to 30th to the end of July to do it. We got to see lots of the river, from the pristine, crystal clear waters to the port of South Louisiana. And a little clarification: when we were going through the port of South Louisiana from Baton Rouge to New Orleans, we did take a center console motorboat through. After some near-death experiences in St. Louis, we figured that was the best way to go through that portion of the river. But the rest of it we did do in the kayak. So that's just a little overview of what we did. Let's start the Q&A. You can raise your hand and I'll repeat the question and we'll answer it. Yes, ma'am, over here.
Jim, I grew up around the Mississippi River, and I know that coming down the Mississippi River, you didn't do a whole lot of paddling.
Have you paddled the river, ma'am?
No, we were scared to death of it.
Yeah, it was... Did we paddle the river? We thought the same. We thought we could just huck fin this all the way from Minnesota to the Gulf of Mexico. Little did we know that probably the swiftest the current got, that surface current got, was probably about 4 or 5 miles an hour just sitting there. The rest of it was just slowly making its way down. So we actually did do quite a bit of paddling down the river. So. Yes, ma'am.
Did you have a crew that went along with you at night that you would get off and with food and tents and all? How'd you do that?
Our crew that went along down with us were the angels of grace and mercy that accompanied us down. It was just me and Jacob and the prayers of everybody who, our friends and families. We did not have a crew. We did have some contacts along the ways. We knew of people in Minneapolis and Memphis, the cities, and that would take us in. We were able to stay in their homes, and they did feed us. But most of the time, as far as food goes and supplying ourselves, we did that along the way. So we would go to stores, we'd lock the kayak up, with a bike lock that I had. Probably not the most secure way to secure a kayak, but it worked. It worked. And that's how we supplied ourselves. Yes, ma'am.
What were your parents' reactions?
That is the constant question every time. So I remember, I guess about 9 months before the trip happened, when we were just kind of thinking about it and planning, I walk in the kitchen talking to my parents, and I said, Jacob and I, we're going to go paddle the Mississippi River. And my mom she thought that was just the greatest adventure. She thought it'd be a great experience for me to do. And my dad looked at me and was like, are you stupid? He was a little more cautious just from some of his experiences around the Mississippi River. So definitely different reactions. Jacob's parents were about the same, except his dad was a little more carefree with it, and his mom, who grew up in New Orleans and saw that side of the river, was not quite as keen to let her boy go. But those were the reactions.
What about traffic?
Traffic. There was lots of different kinds of traffic on the river. We had other kayakers and canoers, especially in the upper part where it's a lot more recreational around Minnesota. Once you get past Minneapolis, that is a commercial river. It is no longer a recreational place. It is where America is supplied with fuel, with gravel, anything that could be moved in a barge. So there was lots of traffic along the ways. And when you get to New Orleans, you have these big tankers from all over the world that are coming in. It was quite an experience. And I guess a little bit to follow up that question with an answer, we would have to roll over the wakes of these vessels a lot of times. These barges and ships, they'd be plowing through the water, and a lot of the times you could a big barge, the waves were big, but they were so far apart you could just glide over them. Surprising enough, it was the bass boats that gave us the worst wakes. It was these fellas who were trying to get to that honey hole, and they were just flying down the river, and the wake, it was just really choppy. So we'd be trying to flounder around in our kayak while these guys were flying down the river in their bass boat. So that's how the traffic was.
Turn over any?
We did not. We did not turn over. We had a close call, actually, as we were, I guess, going along around Osceola, Arkansas, in northern Arkansas. We were coming down over an erosion control dam, or a little dike that juts out from the bank of the river to the channel. And when you go over these dikes, it creates a small waterfall that you have to go over. And so we went over, and we kind of lost our balance and started flipping, started taking in water. And it was a pretty scary moment, actually. Had we flipped, I don't know if we would have been able to get back up. So the kayak, it's built to roll, and we're supposed to know how to roll a kayak, but once you get caught underneath the water, it could be a little dicey. Yes, sir.
Can you speak to any cultural differences that you noticed as you traveled from Minnesota down to Louisiana? Kind of the culturally, the changes that you observed on your trip, especially meeting different people and staying in people's different houses and their traditions and their culture.
In regards to the cultural differences, we did go from about 100 miles from the Canadian border around Lake Chataqua, Minnesota, to southern Louisiana. There's, I would definitely say the accents changed along the ways when you go from Minnesota to how y'all lie down the bayou. And so it was definitely different. When we went through Missouri, there's actually a fair amount of German influence, which is still, people do still speak German. We stayed with a friend of ours whose grandmother grew up in a German, I can't remember if there's a special kind or a special region they're from, but they spoke German, and she taught her grandchildren German. So definitely a lot of cultural differences along the ways. You go up to Minnesota, they eat walleye. You go to Venice, Louisiana, they're eating redfish down there. So there's definitely, I'm trying to think of some other things that culturally are different. I would say just the culture of the boats that they use up north compared to what we use. We would go down, let's see, I'm trying to think. This was Minnesota. A lot of the boats up there, I guess they have keels. They're keel boats, and they use those going down the river. Whereas you get to some of these John boats and these fishing boats down south, they're just different design, and I guess that was just the different water they were going through. You go up north, the river goes through a lot of lakes. It goes through the land of 1,000 lakes, as Minnesota, or land of 10,000 lakes, as Minnesota is known as. So that just affects how people design their watercraft and what they use it for. Yes, ma'am.
Did you ever spend 2 nights in one location, take a day off?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. We did have our rest days for sure. I think after about 2 or 3 days into it, after we had to take a day of just resting in Bemidji, Minnesota, picking off ticks off of us and anything else that decided to follow us from the start, a leech or two. So yes, there were definitely times of resting. When we went through the cities, we would take time to rest and sightsee a little bit. It was kind of a road trip minus the road in a lot of ways. We would stop in Minneapolis for a couple days and visit friends, see a few things there. We stopped in St. Louis and spent the 4th of July there. My family came up, visited us there, and when we got to Lake Providence, we definitely hung out with Jacob's family there.
Did you have hotel reservations?
When we had signal, we would make some hotel reservations in advance. Yeah, most hotels were I guess the Tick and Redbug motel, I guess, was a lot of the times.
So you had your camping gear?
We did have camping gear. I had a 3-man tent that I had traded. I guess that was about a year before, and it came in a lot of handy.
What about the rain?
The rain, if we could paddle through the rain, if it was a light rain, we would go through the rain. But if it was storming and lightning, we figured that was not a good combination with water, and we got off the river, as far as we could off the river, and we would take a little break, a little snooze. I think the second day we were on the river, we had a huge rainstorm, and we just hung out in the tent, slept a lot, and just waited till it passed before we got on.
Did you keep a journal?
Yes, ma'am. We kept a journal the entire way down. Well, most days. There are a few days where I slept in on the journal. But yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am, over here.
Did you stop in Hannibal, Missouri, or to see the pickers in Iowa?
We did stop in Hannibal, Missouri. And as far as Iowa goes, the corn was not quite ready to be cut. But is that what you're referring to?
No, the pickers on TV.
Forgive me.
Right on the river.
Oh, yes. You know, we did paddle past that, and we thought about it, and we were like, is there a few things we could sell that, weighing us down right here, something like that? But Hannibal, Missouri was a great stop. You can't be paddling down the Mississippi River, go through Mark Twain's town, and not spend a little time. It's a really cool place there, just like you would think of it in a book. Just kind of, they make it come to life there. So, right here.
Did you have to sign any waiver as far as any liability or get permission to do the river?
We actually, as far as getting permission to do the river, to paddle down the river, we had to register our kayak in Morrison County, Minnesota, I believe. And once that was where the headwaters would have been. So once we put our kayak in there, we were cleared to paddle down the entire river.
You had a 2-man kayak?
A 2-man kayak, 21-foot long kayak. Yes, sir.
Talk a little more about the preparation and the planning and how you decided what supplies to take and so forth.
So in regards to planning the trip and preparing for the trip, Jacob did his best to see about how long we could paddle each day and when we could get food, where we would be stopping in towns, about how long the trip would take. We planned for about 60 days on the river. We made it in 59 days. So I guess that was pretty good. As far as equipment we brought, we had a radio, a VHS radio that we would use to call in the locks and dams, and if we were in trouble, we had that. As far as gear, I'm trying to think. Lots of mosquito repellent and a lot of prayer. A lot of prayer was a good preparation, but I'm trying to think of anything else. We got maps. I got a U.S. Army Corps of Engineer map of the river from, let's see, that map goes from Minneapolis to the Gulf. And when we got around the headwaters, we had to get a special map for that. So, yes, sir, right here.
Kind of what he said. What other supplies besides the tent, the radio, and the maps? I mean, food and water, things like that.
Food, water, and the maps. We'd have to stop at least once a week to get a supply of food. At the start in Minnesota, we tried to get as many dry goods as we could. We were able to keep some meat with us. We had a small cooler, filled it with ice, and we were able to keep summer sausage. So we had some good protein along the ways. And once we got further down the river and we could stop in towns, we would stop in restaurants. That was a good thing to get to, is stopping in restaurants and you kind of, I guess back to the cultural question, you get to experience a little bit of, what are folks eating around here. You get some cheese curds in Wisconsin. So that's kind of how we plan on that.
So how would you get into town from the kayak? I mean, the river's remote sometimes.
They didn't have many parking places for us coming down, unfortunately. As far as going into town and how we would plan to go into town, usually we would just pull up our kayak on the bank, and sometimes those banks were a little bit steeper than we expected. We'd pull up along the bank, we got a bike lock, and we would just tie it to the kayak and tie it to the tree, lock it up, and just walk our merry way into town. So sometimes it was just right off the river, maybe less than a quarter mile to get to where we wanted to go. Sometimes it was a few miles, and sometimes we had to carry the kayak a few miles over dams. So
What about going through the locks and things like that?
that is probably a good thing. I should go over it. So the Mississippi River, I would divide it into a few sections. You have the upper Mississippi, the headwaters, where it's very recreational, clear water, and it has dams to, I guess, control that recreational side, control the fish, keeps invasive species from getting up there. Then you get to Minneapolis, and you don't have any more dams they have to portage over, but you have the lock and dam system. And that's where, I know we have the Red and the Ouachita kind of in our vicinity, for those who know much about the lock and dam system, but they are used to control the river and the flow of the water as well. Barges go through that, fishing bass boats go through that, kayaks go through it. We went through it just like a barge would. We would paddle down. If I could call them with my cell phone or radio into them and let them know, hey, come in lock 14, we have a southbound orange 21-foot long kayak coming down, and they usually are like, what the heck? What the heck are these guys doing right here? Yeah. So we would go through, and we would go up to the seawall they had. We would let any barges that were trying to get through, they had priority over us. They had priority. They would come through, and then they would readjust the water. Sometimes we would go up, sometimes we would go down, and we would pass through. And sometimes when those barges went through, sometimes we had to spend the night because it was taking 20-something barges to get through it. That doesn't take 30 minutes to get through. That can take a long time, Once you get through those locks and dams, they end in St. Louis. Then that begins, I'd call that's the lower Mississippi. That's where you have the levees and you have the dikes, the erosion control, some of the dredges. Once you get south of St. Louis, it is a wide open river and anything can go through at any time. There's nothing holding you back. Yes, ma'am.
What about wildlife and scary things?
Wildlife and scary things. That's,
Snakes and stuff like that.
what about wildlife and scary things? Good question. We only saw 2 snakes the entire way down, believe it or not. One in Minnesota that swam right next to us, and a water moccasin that fell out of a tree in Tennessee. Other than that, we did not see any snakes. We only saw alligators in the marsh around Venice and Pilot Town, but we never had any come close. I would say we lost count of our deer pretty early on. Once we weren't even in Minneapolis, we just quit counting deer. We saw a black bear swim the river pretty close to the headwaters. That was a pretty cool thing to see because we were paddling down. We look up ahead and this just big dark figures moving across the water. And we get a little bit closer and sure enough it's a bear swimming across. I would say probably the most dangerous animal in the river is the Asian carp. They're these big carp fish that are an invasive species. I didn't really think much of them until I'm paddling into St. Louis with Jacob, and we're paddling. We see him just kind of gracefully jumping. We think it's pretty cool until out of nowhere I feel something smack me in the face and then smack me in the face again. That thing had taken its head, hit me head on, and then took its tail and whacked me around. I was ready to go by that time. I was fighting. I had my knife out. I was not playing with those Asian carp. So, yeah, they're no joke. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, what was the toughest, I'd say, mental challenge of a trip of that length, that distance?
What was the toughest mental challenge the entire? When we thought about giving it up, I would say the heat is just thinking through the heat, and you're in the sun all day. Especially when you get to that lower portion and it's just wide open river. You don't really paddle next to trees or anything. I think there was one time about Osceola, Arkansas, about where we flipped. We had just kind of had that close call. We pulled off on the side of the river and it was hot. We were pretty close to out of water actually at that time. We may have had 2 bottles of water. But we were about like we're not sure if we can complete this trip, if we'll be able to get the whole way down. We might have to hang it up right now. Maybe we'll come back another day. Maybe we'll take another kind of vessel down. But that was probably the time we were ready to give up. Is I guess about a little past midway through it. So, but we just kept on trucking. We had a lot of people that were praying for us and supporting us, and we were entertaining them, I think, a lot with our phone calls and Facebook posts. So, there's a lot we weren't ready to give up on. So,
How did you protect your smartphone in a plastic bag and charging it?
That was our life-proof case, was the good old Ziploc bag. Just stick it in there, and I don't think we had some phone trouble. Jacob's phone was acting up pretty early on in the trip. I think he dropped it in the water or he got his kind of wet. So we actually had to get him a new phone when we were in Minneapolis. But for the most part, we just kept it in Ziploc bags and it never got wet. And charging, in regards to charging our phones, we had some solar chargers and portable chargers. The portable chargers, anytime we went through a city or got close to electricity, we would charge them up, and they'd usually last us about 2 days. The solar chargers, I'm glad we never had to use them because they never decided to work for us. So, yes, ma'am. Yes, sir.
What'd you do about drop off and pick up?
Drop off and pick up. That's a good question. How do we get there and how do we get out of there? So I'm very thankful. My brother, he has his pilot's license, and he's a student at Louisiana Tech right now. He and another friend of ours, they flew us up to St. Clair, Minnesota, and from there we were able to get to Clearwater, Minnesota, where we had bought a kayak online. It was waiting for us up there. It was waiting for us. And so once they got us up there, it was a one-way ticket on the plane and just a one-way ticket down the river down there. But my brother, I owe a lot to him. He's somewhere probably studying down the street at his house here. But he got us up there and he drove us home with the kayak. So sure enough.
How did you keep your legs and all from cramping? There's not the biggest room available in a kayak.
How do we keep our bodies from cramping? That's a very good question, because a lot of people asked if our arms got sore, but really, like you said, it was our legs and backs that would really get tight just from sitting. And what we would do a lot of times, the kayak had these little adjustable footrests in it, and we would move them around a little bit, sometimes a little further to us, a little further a ways, or we would adjust the cushions in our seat just so our bodies were not in the same position the entire time paddling 10, 12 hours a day. Did we encounter any river pirates on the trip? That's a good question. For the most part, people are friendly and kind. When we crossed into Missouri from Iowa, and we did have some ruffians we came across. We decided we were going to camp out on a nice sandbar, which I think was somebody's party sandbar that we had taken over, and they rolled up. We could hear them before we saw them. They had the music going loud, and they were an interesting crew. They were kind of passive aggressive, but at the same time, we could tell that we were in their spot, and they did not appreciate us being in their spot. So I carried a 38 special down with me for protection. I slept a little bit closer to it that night. They didn't bother us. They said they were going to be back about 2 a.m. After we met them at about 6 p.m. But they never showed back up. So that was probably one of the closest calls. I had a paddle stolen from me in Mud Island. We'd put the kayak up there, and somebody took a paddle. But other than that, we really didn't have much trouble with people down the river.
Did you
Yes,
build
ma'am.
fires to cook with? How did you do that?
Did we build fires? Yes, ma'am. We didn't build nearly as many fires as we thought we would. We thought this was going to be a lot of real big camping experience a lot of the times, and it was, but we only built a few fires, and they weren't really necessary. It was really just for kicks and giggles a lot of times. I'd pull some driftwood that was on the bank. As far as fires to cook with, we did cook over a fire maybe a couple of times, but we brought a small butane small cooker that we had, and we had a skillet. We would cook bacon and beans on that. Sometimes I'm trying to think, bratwurst up in Minnesota and that area, they like their bratwurst, and we got some to cook then. So, but just a few fires, no forest fires. So, yes, sir.
Are there still any islands in the Mississippi River?
Are there still any islands? Yes, sir. There are lots of islands. They've got them numbered and named sometimes. But probably, let's see, the islands really, there aren't many of them until you get south of St. Louis. And I guess they just develop with erosion and the soil building up the alluvion. So there are quite a few islands.
Get on gold one?
The island I remember specifically that we got on was when we first crossed into the Louisiana border. There was an island, and that was our first time in a few weeks that we had been back in Louisiana, or on Louisiana soil. So that was the island was our first time back on Louisiana soil. But knowing how the river washes it away, it might be Mississippi soil now. So, yes, sir.
You mentioned flipping the kayak and phone problems. What are the things that went wrong?
All the things that went wrong. That's a good question. I wish I had a list of them. Let's see. Well, we intended to get to the headwaters probably a day earlier than we did, but we didn't get up there right off the bat because of some storms. So I would say sometimes it was the timing that didn't quite go right. We planned to be somewhere by this date, and we were like 7 days behind. Let's see what else went wrong. Oh, so we had a rudder on the back of our kayak that we were able to steer. That's very important, very important. We got very used to the rudder early on as well, because we could just control our voyage down the river a lot better. Well, that rudder, we weren't even in Minneapolis, and that thing snapped. The cables were breaking on it, so we were. That may not seem like a big deal, but it really does help you control it. And once we got past St. Louis into the big wide open river, which does move a little bit faster, and there's a lot more current, there's undercurrents. It was pretty scary not having a rudder and being able to control our way through it. So that was really probably one of the biggest things that was a setback for us.
Did you get it repaired?
I'll answer that. Let's see. So, did we get it repaired? Yes. We were able to get repairs in Minnesota, was the first place we repaired it. We actually got to go to the factory where the kayak was built and the rudder was designed. We were able to go to that place. We were able to see kayaks being built, and we really learned a lot. They fixed the rudder, and they also patched up some places on the bottom of the kayak that we'd scuffed up. The kayak, it was pretty tough. It had Kevlar in it and fiberglass, so it wasn't at the first log that it hit, it wasn't going to pop or anything, but we did need to repair it and replaster it sometimes. We repaired the rudder once we got down to Lake Providence as well. We kind of rednecked it a little bit on some of our repair. Not nearly as good as the factory, but we had some designs of our own to control it. Yes, sir.
What about the transition to the motorboat around Baton Rouge? How did that go?
The transition to the motorboat. So we got out around St. Francisville, Baton Rouge area. My brother and a captain friend of his who could drive boats, he was waiting for us there in Baton Rouge, and it was a smooth transition. Really, we had the kayak with us that we could haul all the way down on the boat. Actually, we had a truck drive it down to where we would meet up with it down past New Orleans. But it was a pretty smooth transition. When you go through the Port of South Louisiana in a motorboat, it's nothing. You can go through that in about a day through there. So wasn't too bad a transition.
You want to do it again?
You coming with me?
And it won't let me.
You paying me? Nah.
Did you come back as good of friends as you were?
We're still friends. I talked to him yesterday, so I guess that's a good thing. People asked if we would do it again, and I would really have to have a better reason than let's just do it for the heck of it. But I have given it some thought. I have been tempted many a day. This would be a cool day to get back on. Lanny, I know Miss Bobby Sue Lynn over here is shaking her head at me. That's not a good idea, probably. But it's been a thought. But really, I guess only if the U.S. government told us we needed to, probably. So.
I think you ought to do a movie.
A movie.
Yeah, one of the independent films.
There's actually I think 2 movies out about it. They're called Dumb and Dumber. So. We were called that a couple times ago down the river. Which one of you is dumb, which one is dumber. So, but yes, sir.
Anymore?
I do paddle. I still paddle around a little bit. Haven't paddled anything near as long as Mississippi. I think the longest trip since then has probably been about 10 miles long, and that was down the Mountain Fork River in Oklahoma. But I still enjoy paddling, just a little bit less a distance probably.
Have you done the door cheat?
I have not done a door cheat, but I've heard I need to paddle that way. So it'd be fun. it doesn't have too many logs in the way for us. Might do that. I've done Darbone a good bit. When the water's high enough, I'll go from Middle Fork, been down Middle Fork some, and I even put in at Shoesrick Creek one time and was able to paddle down. It stinks though. I wouldn't recommend paddling down Shoesrick Creek or Darbone or Middle Fork if you don't have enough water. So, or whatever else is going in that water sometimes. So, yes, sir.
21-foot kayak weigh?
How much does a 21-foot long kayak weigh? Without our gear in it, it weighs about 180 pounds. Well, 180, about 180.
180. How
Yeah.
often did you have to portage?
How often do we have a portage? We had a portage every dam that we came across until Minneapolis. That's there's got to be at least 20 of those things, I would think. Plus the logs that would be across the river. That when you're in the headwaters, you might be going across logs, you might be going across beaver dams, man-made dams. So we went over a fair amount at the beginning. Once we got past St. Louis and the locking dam system, we didn't have any to go over. Now the locks and dams, there were a few locks there were a few dams next to the locks where you could paddle over that. You didn't have to go through where the barges were going through. And those were actually kind of cool, kind of scary. There's probably some other times where we were about to flip when we probably should have gone through like the barges, but we decided to just go over the little dams. We thought they were small enough, so quite a few dams.
What was the draft on the boat when both of you were sitting in it with your gear?
How much was the draft? That's a good question, and we never really thought about that. It couldn't have been that much though, maybe a foot, 2 foot, yeah. At its worst. So probably no more than that, I would think. Yes, sir.
How much did you weigh before and after?
How much did I weigh before and after? That's a good question.
The same. He ate in restaurants.
Yeah, that's right. So I weighed 150 pounds before the trip, and I weighed 135 pounds after the trip. Jacob, I can't remember I don't know how much he weighed, but he lost 10 pounds. So.
How about whirlpools?
Whirlpools. Those were really scary, especially when we did not have the rudder functioning. The whirlpools were very dangerous to go through just because they would spin you around, and that's where, if it had enough force behind it, it'll not just spin you, but it'll flip you too. And not having a rudder to help steer, it was really hard to use our paddles to control which direction we were going.
Y'all did not run at night at all. Got in off the river before dark.
We were not supposed to be running at night at all. And we normally did not run at night. There were a few times where it was probably safer going at night and avoiding traffic and avoiding the sun and the heat than it was going through the day. And there was one time I remember in particular I believe that was Missouri. The water had risen. One of the dams, I believe, had busted on one of the tributaries of the Mississippi, and it was flooded around there. And we couldn't just get out in these flood zones right here. It was just underwater. So it took us. We probably didn't get out till 10:30 that night to find dry land to get out on. And really, it was a miracle getting to that camp spot, because we just, through the night, the darkness, we were looking for a dry place to beach our kayak, and we went from one side of the river to the other side, and we weren't sure, if we were just going to be paddling through the night. And finally, we just decided we were going to cross the river one more time and see if we could find a camp spot. And we got to that other bank, and my light hit a reflection. And it wasn't just like a dry bank, but it was a camping spot that the state of Missouri had cleared. So that was some providence right there. Yes, sir.
What's the weirdest thing you saw or experienced?
What was the weirdest thing that we saw or experienced? Ooh, I'm trying to think. What was the weirdest thing? Let's see. The people of northern Missouri. Probably the people who decided that we had accommodated their camp spot. They were a little bit vulgar, I guess, the best way to put it. I was trying to think of other weird things. The Carp was pretty weird to see. Let me think. There was one day, it was just, I guess this would be just unexpected. We were paddling, and all of a sudden these guys came flying in a bass boat right towards us. I thought they were about to run over us. And so I'm kind of trying to push away from them. And they came up and they had Gatorades for us. And they were like, we came to help y'all out a little bit. Y'all got to be hot on this river. So that was probably one of the stranger things I guess we saw. But I would definitely caution people in northern Missouri so that are coming down in a barnacle bucket. So. Yes, sir.
Did your parents put any rules or regulations on you guys when you were coming down the river, like having to call every night or anything like that?
Did our parents put any rules or regulations? I think when we were by ourselves on the river, it was kind of fair game. It was you're either gonna live or die. So they didn't have much. It was nice. They appreciated phone calls and they would check in and they actually did have we had a GPS, and they were able to get on the internet and track and see where we were, as a matter of fact. So that was nice. But as far as rules and regulations, it was you live and you learn. So, yes, sir.
What about pollution? Did you see much of it?
Did we see any pollution? That's a good question, considering that we saw a lot of different stages of the river. I would say, as far as pollution goes, when you're at the headwaters, that water is crystal clear. You can see straight to the bottom of the river. It's shallow enough to you can see straight to the bottom. But once you get into Minneapolis, and there's definitely a lot more industry there. It's definitely a lot muddier, and there's a lot more things that are just kind of floating down the river too. So there's a lot more trash, I guess you could say. So we did see some pollution. We saw a difference in the river.
Where was it worse?
The worst place for pollution, yeah, probably between Louisiana and Mississippi is where we saw the most of it, the most pollution. And going through the port of South Louisiana, there's a lot that finds itself on the banks, old tires and such. So, but yeah, from looking at the start of it to the finish of it, there's a huge difference in the water quality, I'd say.
Were there any other people doing this along with you that you could see?
As far as other people who were doing the trip, I would say there were probably about 30 people who actually did the same trip that we did that summer of 2018. Some of them started a little bit before us, some of us a little bit after us. And we were able to contact some of those people. They were able to contact us and give us advice or ask for advice. So it was interesting to see how many people did it, how many people do it. I'm on Facebook and I watch a page called the Mississippi River Paddlers, and it's people that are going down the river. There's two guys who just finished their trip. I think they built a small paddle wheel boat, and they took it from Minneapolis down. So it's really interesting to see what people take down the river. Actually, a few weeks ago, I read a story about a man who decided he would hop on a log of driftwood and just float down the river. The United States Coast Guard picked him up and said he couldn't do that. So I'm glad that he didn't. So yes, indeed.
Cruise ships? Did you see cruise ships?
Did we see any cruise ships? Yes, we saw cruise ships, and that was only, but no further north than Baton Rouge, no further upriver than Baton Rouge. Just the bridges are only so tall enough. Now there are some riverboat cruises like the Natchez. We did see the Natchez and the American Queen. We got to see them along the way, so it was kind of cool. You hear about these vessels, these old school paddle wheel vessels, and we got to see them for ourselves. Yes, sir.
How often did you find yourself out of range of contact by iPhone or whatever?
When did we lose signal? We lost signal a fair amount of the time when we were really south of St. Louis was where we didn't have as much signal. When we were north of there, the first couple of days, we didn't have signal. We were in probably a kind of protected river and forest area. I can't remember if it was national or state park, but it was pretty rural, and there were no telephone lines. We were able to keep signal, though, from Bemidji, our first town, till Minneapolis. We were able to keep a good bit of signal there. Once you get to the wide open river, it's pretty hard to get signal. So.
Did you ever overnight with any other people going down the river?
Did we overnight with any other people? We did not stay stay with anybody else who was going down. We would pass people who were doing the same trip as us, but we didn't really tag along with them. There was one guy from Cape Girardeau, Missouri, that we've gotten to be friends with even after the trip. He's about 21, 22, and he paddled. He didn't go through New Orleans though. He actually took the Chataqua. He started at Lake Chataqua, but he decided to go the Chataqua to Vermilion Bay. And as we were coming into Vicksburg, he had finished his trip and was driving back to Missouri. So we did get to meet up with him. Vicksburg was on the way, and we were able to meet him. And we had stayed with his family, actually, in Cape Girardeau, just through mutual contact. And we're like I said, we're still friends. I invited him to hunt with us the hunting season afterwards. So, well, are there any more questions, or think we're about questioned out? So,
This has been wonderful.
yes, sir.
Two-part question. What did this experience teach you about America, and what did it teach you about yourself?
That's a very good introspective question. I need to start writing down the answer for that, so I'm not getting a curveball. What did it teach about America? I think it goes right back to that question about culture. We're definitely we definitely do things different. We sound a little different. You come along the ways, we look a little different sometimes. But we're still Americans, and we still are people. We have feelings, we have thoughts, we have things that ought to be respected. And I think that's one thing that I learned about America along the ways. It's just how different we are, but yet how beautiful we are in that diversity, I would say. What did I learn about myself? And talking with, I wish Jacob was here to kind of give his answers on this too. He's a lot more well spoken on these topics. But as far as what I learned about myself, I think it was definitely that it was less of a lesson of independence than dependence for me. I think going through this trip, it taught me how prayer is so important in our lives, and how our relationship with Jesus Christ, who Jesus Christ is to us, is the most important thing. I really think that's what it comes down to, is where it had me in my faith, what it taught me through that, to depend on the Lord for everything, and to be thankful for everything that we get, to be thankful for the breath that we get up, we're allowed to have, to get up and paddle, for that paddle that we can get down the river with it, and just thankful for all the people that were supporting us and wanting to see us complete that voyage down the ways. It was more than just an adventure of, hey, we got to go down the longest river in America, one of the longest rivers in the world. It was an experience where we're able to see God at work in a lot of ways, in the little things and biggest things in our lives. So close on that. Thank you.